How's it going, everybody? My name is Dylan, and today I'm going to be installing the internet's sickest leg vise. For a little while, I've been following an artist online called Shock's Functional Art, and he makes some of the sickest stuff. And for a little while now, I've been wanting to install a leg vise, and so I figured why not have him do some sick art on it for me. Shock's does this kind of work all the time on the regular, and since he loves doing custom work, this was no problem for him. Now, because he enjoys doing custom work, I'm going to be leaving a link down in the description for a way for you to get a hold of him if you want to do that, but I found him over on TikTok, so I'm going to be putting his TikTok handle down there as well. Also, if you want to see how the leg vise was made, he's also going to be uploading a YouTube video here as well, so I'll leave a link to his YouTube page as well. Now, the design for this vise was really interesting. I came across this cool dual screw method. Now, this is completely different from something like a Moxon vise or a twin screw system because the threading on the bottom serves a different purpose from the threading on the top. For the bottom vise screw, I decided to use this leveling leg for a scaffolding. Now, I've actually used these before to make an entire vise, but for this build, I only needed it for the bottom. Now, this is going to be a lot easier to install if I get rid of all these ridges on these flanges here. Now, one of the tricks I've picked up over the years is that these chair seats are a really good source of solid hardwood. They're a little bit tricky to mill down, but it's really not too difficult. I usually just pin nail a straight edge to the seat, and then I can cut off one side and then use that as the reference to cut off the other side, and then I can run the whole thing through the planer. At this point, I can find the rough center of the wood using the flange, and then I can draw an accurate circle around that center. And then by doing some careful layout, I can create this gear pattern. And then I can cut the gear out over on the scroll saw. The cool thing about making a gear like this is it's a faux gear. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to look nice. I drilled a hole in the center of the gear to accept the round portion of the flange. And then once I had that fitting really nicely, I was able to use that as a reference to draw out the rest of the flange. This all gets routed out and then epoxied into place. Now, I really don't do this very often with the router, and you can kind of see that here. I realized I was making way too deep of a pass and trying to route out way too quickly, so I had to slow down and raise the bit and do it in multiple passes, but that really wasn't the problem. But now I do have this little defect in the gear. It's not going to be seen very often, so I'm not really too worried about it. I sanded this gear all the way down to a 320, and then I could epoxy the flange in. I threw a little bit of epoxy on the top and really jammed it into the corners for good measure. Now, this is the other centerpiece of the project. This is an antique vise screw, and it came with literally no information about it, so I don't know anything about it other than it's antique. But because it's so much darker than the other screw that I bought, I'm going to be trying to darken this one. And to do that, I'm going to be using some cold blue, which I've never done before, and this is my first attempt with it, so we'll see how it turns out. I started out by washing the entire thing down and hitting it with a little bit of steel wool, and then re-washing it, and then I just started slathering on the cold blue. I really didn't know what I was doing other than just putting the cold blue on the metal. I did end up figuring out that if you use the steel wool on top of the cold blue, it sort of evens out all your high points and low points of what is and is not accepting the cold blue. In the end, I did end up with a little bit of blotchiness, and I'm not 100% sure what caused that, but I think it's good enough for this project. My intent with this part was not to make it perfect, but really just to make it match the top screw just a little bit better. And I still think this is leagues above that silver color that it was. Now I needed to drill all of the holes for the vise screws in both the vise jaw and the bench itself. So to make sure I didn't misdrill anything, because there's a lot of holes to drill, I decided to start out with a pilot hole in the vise jaw. Now, unfortunately, the vise jaw was a bit too big to fit on my drill press, so I was using my mobile drill press for a lot of these operations. And then I can bring the vise jaw over to the bench to get the proper height for the hole on the bench. I think I used 3 different size Forstner bits for all of these holes. And so for the vise jaw, I used the smallest of the Forstner bits so that I would have a nice tight fit with the vise screw. I drilled most of the way through with the mobile drill press, and then I flipped the piece over, and using the pilot hole, I drilled through from the other side as well. This ended up working very well. And then I needed to mill out a recess for the flange of the vise screw so that it could be attached to the jaw. This part was a bit more complicated because I had to match a bracket on the vise screw. I even had to route out a little bit of a recess to accept that bracket. I decided to drill a slightly oversized hole in the front of the bench to accept the vise screw. And then on the back of the bench, I could drill an even wider hole to accept the nut that comes with the vise screw. The nut has this little flanged piece that keeps it from spinning when the vise screw is turning, and so I decided just to chisel that out. It seemed easy enough. Now this bottom screw is going to be riding right along the top of this cross support here. And I decided I wanted to leave just a little bit of room, so I just marked the height of the rod and drilled that as my center hole. I used my square to measure the same height on both sides of my bench, and then I could drill to the center from both sides. I didn't bother doing a pilot hole in this one because it doesn't have to be nearly as accurate as the top screw. I decided to take a little bit of paste wax and completely coat both of the vice screws so that they would slip a little bit easier. And I also chamfered the holes so I wouldn't get any tear out. I couldn't fit the router back here because of this cross support, so I just used some 40 grit sandpaper and rounded it over that way. Alright, the problem that I was hoping to avoid is officially happening, and I don't see a good way around it. I told Shocks to go ahead and put his symbol on the bottom of the inside of the vise. I was thinking small, but I didn't tell him where the vise screw was going to be, and so he made it like a 14-inch symbol. There's a 14-inch tall piece here, and unfortunately that's right where this bottom vice screw needs to go, like exactly right over it. Now it's still going to look cool because you're still going to see the symbol underneath it, but unfortunately most of it's going to be covered up, so sorry Shocks, don't be angry at me. It's getting covered up. Using a pick I marked all 4 hole locations, and then I drilled all those holes out over on the workbench. I also didn't want the hardware to look funny, so I put some cold blue on all the hardware as well. And then I could finally install this bottom vice screw right over the top of Shock's beautiful work. You have no idea how much this frustrated me to do. The last thing I wanted to do was to cover up any of the artwork Shocks did, but the screw really couldn't have gone anywhere else. The next part I needed to make was the handle for the vice screw. And this really needed to be something that matched the vice. This piece of wood is actually one of the first pieces of wood that I'd ever milled in my own shop. And I'm using the term milled very loosely here because I cut it up on the bandsaw and then let it dry for about 3 years. And then this specific piece has sat in my shop ever since. So this has actually been in my shop for probably around a decade now. But it has this absolutely beautiful grain to it that I knew was going to work perfect for this project. After polishing this all the way up to a 1500 grit, I just used a little bit of mineral spirits to get rid of the sawdust. I never actually put any finish on this. I personally really like the look of the black handles after they've been used for a couple of years. I think they look really cool. And then I needed to make 2 of these maple pommels for the dowel to fit into. In the past I've just used wood glue to glue these together, but I didn't really feel like waiting, and I kind of wanted to see if I could just use a little bit of super glue and if these would stay on. So far they've held pretty well, so I'm really not too worried. Okay, here's your 2-day update. It didn't hold. Use wood glue. Now that everything is at its final height, I could finally sand everything down, and I decided to sand down the entire bench as well, just to give everything a nice clean finish. I like to do this about once a year anyway, so this was a perfect time for this. One of the biggest features of owning a leg vise is that you can plane down the edge of really long pieces. And one of the things you can add to aid that is a couple of holes in the side of your bench that can accept a dowel so that you can place long pieces on one end and then clamp it on the other. I didn't really know how many of these holes I needed to drill, but I figure I can always drill more in the future. I've only done 4 so far, but that might be all I need. It really won't be that much work just to drill more in the future. After giving the top of the jaw a light sanding, I went out and found the exact same lacquer that Shocks used on the original piece so that I can match the top to the rest of the vice jaw. But on the top of my workbench, I always like to use oils. And this time I decided to use this dark walnut Danish oil, mostly because I've never used it before and I think it would look kinda cool. It made the tail vise and the top of the bench look really cool, but the side of the bench, because it's just made of construction lumber, ended up just a little bit blotchy, but I think it's okay. I also put a little bit of that lacquer on this gear as well. And then I can finally install the vice jaw for the last time. Now here is the coolest thing about this vise. The reason I added this second screw on the bottom is so that when you're clamping pieces down, no matter how you design the jaw, you're always going to get a little bit of flexing. And so if you kick this gear here at the bottom, what that basically does is it acts as a counterforce so that things can be clamped very firmly. Every wood vise that I've ever made has had the same issue where it flexes too much, but this one is going to work so much better than those because of this beautiful design. And just to be clear, I was not the one who originally came up with this design. It's actually a design by Jack English Machines here on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description to his channel as well. A huge thank you goes out to Shocks Functional Art for making me this vice jaw. This has got to be one of the coolest things I've ever added to my shop. I know I say that a lot, but look at this thing. So if you want to find him, go ahead and check out the links in the description. I'm also going to be leaving a lot of links to all of the products that I used in this video that you can buy in a store. You know, it just occurred to me, I forgot to tell you one of the coolest parts about this vise. This vise has a secret, but instead of telling you, how about I just show you?